June 1944. High above the deep blue of the Philippine Sea, the air is heavy with heat and engine noise. Sunlight flashes across aluminum wings as dozens of aircraft converge at altitude. Vapor trails crisscross the sky like scars, marking where seconds ago men were alive and maneuvering. Inside a Mitsubishi A6M a Japanese naval pilot scans the horizon. For nearly 3 years, this aircraft has ruled these skies. Light, agile, deadly in the hands of experienced men. American fighters were once predictable, slow to climb, easy to outturn, vulnerable when pressed hard. But today, something is different. Ahead, dark shapes cut upward through the clouds with alarming speed. Broad wings, heavy frames. They do not circle cautiously. They charge straight through the formation. Gunfire erupts, not brief bursts, but sustained, crushing streams of 50 caliber rounds. A Zero shudders, its wing tears away. Another spirals down, trailing smoke. The American fighters do not slow. They climb, roll, and return again, untouched. For the first time in the Pacific Air War, Japanese pilots are not dictating the fight. They are reacting to it. And in that moment, as the balance of the sky shifts decisively, the Mitsubishi Zero meets an enemy it was never designed to face. The Grumman F6F Hellcat. When war erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, Japan entered the conflict with one decisive advantage in the air. The Mitsubishi A6M was not just a fighter aircraft, it was the embodiment of a doctrine refined over years of combat in China and shaped by the Imperial Japanese Navy's vision of aerial supremacy. The Zero had been designed with ruthless clarity of purpose. It was light because it sacrificed armor. It was agile because it abandoned self-sealing fuel tanks. It could outturn almost any opponent because survivability had been traded for performance. In the hands of well-trained pilots, many of whom had thousands of flight hours, the aircraft was lethal. At Pearl Harbor, the Zero escorted bombers with ease, sweeping aside American defenders flying obsolete or poorly coordinated aircraft. In the months that followed, the pattern repeated itself across the Pacific. In the Philippines, over the Dutch East Indies, and above the skies of Malaya, Japanese fighters achieved air superiority rapidly and decisively. American pilots flying the P-40 Warhawk or the F-4F Wildcat learned painful lessons. Dogfighting a Zero on its terms was suicidal. The Japanese fighter climbed faster, turned tighter, and punished hesitation instantly. Entire squadrons were wiped out in encounters where American aircraft never stood a chance. The Zero's dominance was not only technical, it was psychological. Japanese pilots came to expect victory in the air. They controlled engagements, chose when to fight, and disengaged at will. Allied pilots, by contrast, were forced into defensive tactics, relying on teamwork and discipline simply to survive. Yet this dominance rested on fragile foundations. The Zero's design philosophy assumed short wars, elite pilots, and decisive early victories. It was optimized for offense, not endurance. Against opponents who learned, adapted, and improved, its weaknesses would eventually matter. By mid-1942, American naval aviation began to stabilize. New tactics emerged, most notably the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver that used paired aircraft to counter the Zero's turning advantage. Pilots were trained to avoid turning fights, instead using diving attacks and coordinated fire to strike and withdraw. These adaptations saved lives, but they did not reverse the balance of power. The Zero still held the edge in maneuverability, and Japanese pilots still held the advantage in experience. The skies remained contested, but not equal. Meanwhile, the strategic situation shifted.
The Battle of Midway in June 1942 inflicted catastrophic losses to Japan's carrier force, including many of its most experienced aviators. Though the Zero remained formidable, the men flying it became harder to replace. Training pipelines shortened, combat experience thinned. American industry, by contrast, accelerated. Aircraft production surged, training programs expanded, lessons from early defeats were absorbed, analyzed, and translated into design requirements for a new generation of fighters. By late 1942, the U.S. Navy recognized a fundamental truth. Adapting tactics was not enough. To defeat the Zero consistently, it needed an aircraft designed specifically to survive against it, and ultimately to overpower it. That realization set the stage for a transformation in American naval aviation, one that would redefine the balance of the Pacific sky. The shift did not happen overnight. It emerged from analysis, frustration, and an industrial response unmatched in scale. By 1942, American naval aviation had reached a hard conclusion. Courage and coordination could blunt the Zero's edge, but they could not erase it. The aircraft itself had to change. Survivability had to matter as much as performance. Firepower had to be overwhelming. Pilots needed to be protected, not sacrificed. This philosophy ran counter to the design culture that had produced the Zero. American engineers did not design fighters around the assumption of elite pilots fighting short wars. They designed them for attrition, for replacement, for sustained conflict across oceans. Aircraft needed to absorb damage and return home. Pilots needed armor behind their seats and fuel tanks that did not ignite at the first hit. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation understood this reality better than most. Its previous naval fighter, the F-4F Wildcat, had been outclassed by the Zero in maneuverability, but it had proven something equally important. It could take punishment. Wildcat pilots often returned with holes torn through wings and fuselage, aircraft that a Zero would not survive. Grumman took those lessons and pushed them further. The result was the XF-6F prototype, an aircraft conceived not as a duelist but as a killer. The F-6H Hellcat was larger, heavier, and more powerful than anything the Imperial Japanese Navy had faced. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, giving the aircraft exceptional climb, speed, and acceleration. Armor plating protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire risk. 650 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower, capable of shredding lightly built aircraft in seconds. The Hellcat could dive fast, climb aggressively, and critically, survive mistakes. This was not elegance, it was intention. Training evolved alongside the aircraft. American pilots were taught to fight vertically, not horizontally. They learned to use altitude as energy, diving through enemy formations at high speed and pulling away before a Zero could respond. Engagements were planned. Discipline replaced improvisation. By late 1943, Hellcats began reaching the fleet in growing numbers. Their arrival coincided with a broader strategic shift. The U.S. Navy moved from defensive containment to offensive advance across the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, and deeper into the Central Pacific. Japanese pilots noticed immediately. Zeros that once dictated the terms of combat now struggled to keep pace. American fighters no longer bled energy in tight turns. They attacked from above, disengaged at will, and returned in waves. Damage that once meant death now meant a damaged aircraft limping back to a carrier deck. At first, Japanese command attributed losses to pilot fatigue or bad luck, but encounter after encounter told the same story. The Zero was being outclimbed, outdived, outgunned. The sky was changing. And with each engagement, the shock deepened. Not because the Hellcat was invincible, but because it represented something far more dangerous, an enemy that had learned, adapted, and arrived with overwhelming force. That realization would soon be tested under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable, where doctrine, technology, and human endurance would collide in full view of history. For Japanese naval aviators, the air war in the Pacific was never just a contest of machines. It was a test of identity. Before 1943, Japanese pilots were among the most respected warriors in the Imperial Armed Forces. Their training was long, selective, and unforgiving. Many had flown combat missions over China before the war even began. They had learned to trust their instincts, their aircraft, and the doctrine that emphasized initiative and aggressive maneuvering. The Zero rewarded that mindset. It responded instantly to control inputs,